If you've been paying attention to the noise around the Detroit Lions this offseason, you can feel it starting to change. This isn't just random draft talk anymore. Something is clearly forming, and the league is basically telling us where it thinks Detroit is headed. Yeah, this offense is still loaded with playmakers, but make no mistake, this team has always gone as far as the trenches take it. And in 2025, that foundation didn't look as untouchable as we're used to seeing. There were stretches where the offensive line just wasn't imposing its will the way Lions fans expect. And now, that uneasiness is turning into a real, unavoidable conversation. The future of Taylor Decker. With Decker openly considering retirement, this isn't some long-term what-if anymore. This is a right-now issue, and the rest of the NFL sees it coming. Mock draft after mock draft is sending the same message. Out of 23 recent projections, more than half have the Lions going offensive line at pick 17. That's not a coincidence. That's the league looking at Detroit and saying, this is the spot that could decide what the Lions become next. And if you're a fan, you already know, what happens in the trenches this offseason might shape everything that comes after. At pick number 17, Detroit is positioned in a range that lines up well with the strength of this offensive line class. Francis Mauigoa from Miami is one of the names you see repeatedly. He's a right tackle by trade, standing 6'6" and 325 pounds, and his production jumps off the page when you look at pass protection grades and run blocking efficiency. What makes him particularly intriguing for Detroit is the flexibility. Mauigoa has lived on the right side, but there is a very real belief that either he or Penei Sewell could handle a move to the left if the Lions decide that is the best long-term answer once Decker steps away. That kind of versatility is exactly what Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell have shown they value. Spencer Fano out of Utah is another tackle being frequently linked to Detroit. He's slightly lighter at 300 pounds, but his athletic profile stands out. Analysts describe him as fluid in space, quick in short areas, and capable of transitioning to left tackle if needed. The context matters here. The Lions' offense felt the absence of Ben Johnson in 2025, and maintaining structural integrity up front becomes even more critical when scheme continuity is challenged. Fano represents a player who could grow into a cornerstone rather than just a stopgap. Inside the line, Ioan Vega from Penn State is gaining traction as well. At 6'4" and 335 pounds, he fits the physical identity Detroit has leaned into under Campbell. There's also an interesting ripple effect here. If the Lions want to shuffle Tate Ratledge to center, adding a powerful interior presence like Vega could help stabilize that transition. The idea is not just replacing bodies, but reshaping the line to sustain Detroit's bruising offensive style late into games and late into seasons, something that slipped at times last year. Then there's Caden Proctor from Alabama, a massive human being at 6'7" and 360 pounds. His size alone changes how defenses have to line up. But what stands out is that he moves better than you'd expect. He generates displacement at the point of attack, and has shown he can impose his will even against top competition. He's still developing, but the upside is obvious, especially for a team that wants to plan for life after Decker, rather than scramble when the time finally comes. Caleb Lomu from Utah is another option in that same conversation. He's more polished as a pass protector, with strong athletic traits and processing ability, though questions remain about his play strength, particularly for a team that prides itself on physical dominance up front. When you zoom out, it's notable that 6 of the mocks connecting offensive linemen to Detroit settle on either Mauigoa or Fano. That concentration suggests these two could be the sweet spot if they're still on the board at 17, though there's always the possibility their stock rises beyond Detroit's reach. Still, the underlying theme is consistent. The Lions are being viewed as a team preparing for a transition, not reacting to a collapse. Of course, the mock draft conversation doesn't stop with the offensive line. Defensive tackle Caden McDonald from Ohio State is being linked to Detroit as well. At 326 pounds, he's seen as one of the best run defenders in the class, and that fits a Lions defense that will always prioritize stopping the run. Even with Aleem McNeil and Tyleik Williams projected as starters in 2026, the desire to add more punch inside remains a constant in how outsiders view this roster. Edge rusher projections are lighter than usual for Detroit, which is interesting in itself. Keldrick Falk from Auburn and T.J. Parker from Clemson are the two primary names floating around. Both are seen as potential complements to Aiden Hutchinson, with the size and power to hold up on the edge. Still, the relative lack of edge projections compared to past years says a lot about how pressing the offensive line questions have become.
Cornerback is the wild card. Names like Jermaine McCoy, Mansour Delane, and Avion Terrell are popping up in some mocks, largely driven by injury concerns and depth issues in the secondary. McCoy's ACL injury complicates evaluations, while Delane and Terrell represent different bets on upside and physical limitations. The reaction from fans has been mixed, and understandably so, given how much capital Detroit has already invested in defensive backs. Free agency could reshape this entire conversation, especially with uncertainty around the nickel role, but right now, corner feels more like a secondary option than a primary plan. All of this paints a picture of a Lions team at an important crossroads. The roster is good enough to compete, but the margins matter, and the offensive line sits at the center of that equation. The mocks aren't just throwing names at Detroit randomly. They're reflecting a belief that this front office will stay true to its identity and get ahead of a looming transition before it becomes a crisis. Based on everything you're seeing here, do you believe the Lions should use the 17th pick to start planning for life after Taylor Decker, or would you rather see them address another position first? The interesting part of this discussion is that nothing about these projections suggests panic from Detroit. Instead, it feels like patience paired with realism. The Lions are not being mocked into offensive linemen because the unit collapsed, but because the standard has been so high that even a slight drop in consistency becomes noticeable. When you build an offense around physicality, timing, and balance, the offensive line is not just another position group, it is the foundation. That's why the idea of waiting until Taylor Decker officially retires feels out of character for this front office. Everything Brad Holmes has shown so far points toward anticipation rather than reaction. What also stands out is how cleanly these prospects align with what Detroit already values. Malagoa, Fano, Vega, Proctor, Lamu, all of them check boxes that go beyond measurables. Size, toughness, positional flexibility, and the ability to function in both pass protection and a downhill run game are recurring themes. Even the discussion about possibly moving Penei Sewell or transitioning a rookie to the left side reflects confidence in coaching and development, not fear of change. This is a staff that believes it can mold talent as long as the raw traits and mindset are right. The interior conversation with Ione Vega is especially telling. The fact that analysts are already discussing how his presence could allow Tate Ratledge to slide to center shows how interconnected the Lions' plans could be. This wouldn't just be a one-player fix, it would be a reshaping of the line's future structure. That kind of flexibility is valuable when you're trying to stay competitive year after year instead of cycling through short-term answers. On the defensive side, the projections almost feel like reminders rather than alarms. Caden McDonald's name comes up because Detroit's identity on defense starts with stopping the run. Even with Alan McNeil and Tylik Williams projected to start, the idea of adding another powerful interior defender fits the philosophy. It's about waves, depth, and keeping the standard high, not replacing failure. The same logic applies to edge rushers. While the edge class appears muddled beyond the top names, players like Keldrick Falk and TJ Parker are being viewed as complementary pieces, not saviors. Aiden Hutchinson is already the centerpiece, and anything added there is about balance and support. The cornerback debate might be the most emotionally charged among fans, and that tension shows up clearly in how mock drafts are received. Injuries have exposed depth issues, and playing heavy man coverage demands a lot from defensive backs. Jahmyr McCoy's talent is undeniable, but the ACL injury clouds the projection. Mansour Delane's rise reflects how quickly value can change after a strong SEC season, while Avion Terrell brings that familiar conversation about size versus playmaking instincts. The mixed reactions from fans make sense, especially considering how much Detroit has already invested in the secondary through both the draft and free agency. Add in the uncertainty of free agency, including the potential departure of Amick Robertson, and you can see how priorities could shift quickly. Still, even among analysts, there's a sense that cornerback help could come later rather than at 17. When you pull all of this together, the picture becomes clearer. The Lions are being viewed as a team that is close, but not complacent. The offensive line projections dominate because that group sets the tone for everything else. Whether it's protecting the quarterback, sustaining the run game, or imposing physicality late in games, the line remains the heartbeat of this roster. Drafting an offensive lineman in the first round would not be a flashy move, but it would be a very Lions move, one rooted in identity and long-term thinking. Now it really comes down to how you see this moment. Do you lean into the idea of securing the future of the offensive line while you have the chance at pick 17? Or do you gamble that the current group can hold up and use that selection elsewhere? What keeps this entire conversation grounded is that nothing here exists in a vacuum. Every position being mocked to Detroit ties back to a clear philosophical throughline that this front office has followed since day one. When analysts keep circling back to offensive line prospects at pick 17, they're not guessing blindly, they're reacting to patterns. Detroit has consistently shown that it values sustainability over short-term fixes, and the offensive line is the clearest example of that mindset. You don't wait for the wheels to fall off before you reinforce the foundation, especially when you believe your competitive window is open right now. There's also an important timing element that can't be ignored. Picking at 17 places the Lions in a rare sweet spot. They're not reaching for need, and they're not fishing for leftovers either. The prospects being discussed are players who could realistically be available and still carry legitimate first-round value. That matters, because Detroit has shown restraint in the past when the board doesn't fall the right way. If one of these offensive linemen is there, the decision becomes less about desperation and more about discipline. Another layer to all of this is how comfortable Detroit has become with letting the board speak to them instead of forcing a storyline. In past eras, Lions drafts were often driven by urgency or public pressure. What you're seeing now in these projections is the opposite. The mocks aren't screaming about holes, they're quietly pointing toward opportunities. That's a significant shift in how this franchise is viewed, and it comes directly from roster stability. When analysts debate whether Detroit should go offensive line, defensive tackle, edge, or even corner, it's not because the team is weak at all of them, it's because the Lions are strong enough to be selective. That's also why the offensive line conversation refuses to fade. Even with questions elsewhere, the idea of reinforcing the line resonates because it amplifies everything Detroit already does well. A stronger, deeper offensive line protects against regression. It guards the run game when injuries pile up. It gives the coaching staff flexibility when adjusting schemes. Most importantly, it preserves the identity that has carried this team to relevance. That identity doesn't change just because a season had some bumps in 2025. It's worth noting how often mock drafters emphasize physicality when pairing prospects with Detroit. Whether it's Vega's interior power, Proctor's overwhelming size, or Malagoa's ability to anchor against strength, the common thread is violence at the point of attack. That's not accidental. Dan Campbell's influence is felt even in how outsiders talk about this roster. Detroit isn't being linked to finesse solutions. They're being linked to players who can impose themselves, grow into leaders, and survive the grind of the NFC. Defensively, the same theme appears in subtler ways. Caden McDonald isn't being mocked because he racks up flashy sack numbers, but because he's difficult to move. Edge prospects are framed as compliments rather than stars because Hutchinson already sets the tone. Even the cornerback discussion centers on physicality, man coverage ability, and willingness to tackle. Everything points back to a team that wants to dictate terms rather than react. What makes this moment fascinating is that Detroit doesn't have to decide today. Free agency will clarify some of these questions. If certain veterans return, or if others walk, the draft board will look different. But the fact that offensive line help keeps rising to the top before any of that happens tells you how foundational it is to the Lions' long-term vision. It's the safest investment and, in many ways, the most honest one. So as draft season continues and the noise gets louder, remember this: the Lions are no longer drafting to fix who they were, they're drafting to protect who they've become. That's a powerful place for a franchise to be. What really reinforces this entire projection cycle is how little resistance there is nationally to the idea of Detroit investing again in the offensive line. In other markets, that type of repetition might be questioned. With the Lions, it's almost expected. That tells you the reputation this team has built. Analysts aren't asking whether Detroit understands its identity anymore. They're assuming it does and projecting accordingly. When half of the mocks land on offensive linemen without controversy, it's a reflection of trust in how this front office thinks. There's also a subtle acknowledgement here that the Lions are operating on a longer runway than most contenders. Teams that feel pressure to win immediately often chase positions tied to splash plays or public narratives. Detroit, by contrast, is being mocked as a team willing to make a pick that might not dominate headlines on draft night but could define the next 5 seasons. That patience is a luxury earned through roster construction, not optimism. You can also feel how the potential departure of Taylor Decker acts as a quiet countdown rather than a siren. The conversation isn't emotional, it's methodical. That matters because emotional drafting is how franchises get trapped. The Lions aren't being paired with desperation reaches at tackle. They're being paired with players who naturally fall into their range and philosophy. That alignment is rare, and when it happens, front offices tend to capitalize on it. Even the secondary and pass rush discussions reinforce this idea of balance. Edge rushers are framed as complementary pieces, not solutions. Cornerbacks are debated carefully, weighed against past investments and scheme demands. Nothing feels forced, everything feels layered. That's what separates teams building for sustained success from teams chasing one good year. As more mocks roll in and new names enter the conversation, the surface details will change, but the core message probably won't. Detroit is expected to protect its foundation. The offensive line is that foundation, and as long as